Hi, I think we're going to start. I hope everyone brought their winter coats. This is very cold in here. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight, whether you're here with us at the Whitney or tuning in virtually from afar. I'm Marcela Guerrero. I'm the DeMartini Family Curator at the Whitney. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Before the Volcanoes Sing, a conversation with Clarissa Tossin and a few of her collaborators. Tonight's conversation is part of a series of public programs organized in conjunction with the Whitney Biennial 2024, Even Better Than the Real Thing, co-curated by my colleagues Meg Only and Christy Isles. Clarissa's film is one of the many works included in the biennial, so if you haven't seen it, please make sure you don't miss it. It is currently on view on the 5th floor, or if you're not in New York or can't come to the museum, you can watch the film from the comfort of your home. For the first time ever, the museum has partnered with Mubi, M-U-B-I, to stream a selection of the biennial films, so please know that this is also an option. As tonight's program considers the ongoing and layered processes of displacement and translation of Maya ritual artworks, it seems especially important to acknowledge that the Whitney is located in Lenapehoking, the ancestral homeland of the Lenape people. As a result of centuries of colonialism, today the Lenape live in a diaspora throughout the US and Canada. Alongside the Lenape, many other indigenous nations have ancestral ties to this place now known as New York, including the 6 Haudenosaunee nations, Seneca, Cayuga, Tuscarora, Mohawk, Oneida, and Onondaga, and the Shinnecock and Puspatok. If you're joining us online, please take a moment to identify and recognize the indigenous people who have always and continue to steward the land from where you're joining us. We have an ambitious program tonight, so I'm eager to dive in. Before I do, I would like to read brief bios of our speakers and then turn the microphone to them. Jared Katz is a Mesoamerican archaeologist who leverages new technology to increase accessibility to the past in both museums and university settings. He is currently Associate Curator of the Americas and Africa at the Racklin Murphy Museum of Art at the University of Notre Dame. Alethia Lozano Birrueta is Principal Flautist with the UNAM Philharmonic Orchestra and the Minería Symphony Orchestra, both in Mexico City. Michelle Agnes Magalhaes is a composer working in the fields of instrumental music, chamber music, symphony, and opera, as well as hybrid electronic and interactive forms. And last but not least, we have Clarissa Tossin, who I have the pleasure of knowing for almost 15 years and whose practice I've been following since those, early 2010 or 11. She is a Brazilian-born artist currently based in Los Angeles. Her collaborative research-based practice develops alternative narratives found in the built environment using elements of installation, sculpture, and moving image to explore intersections of place, history, and aesthetics. So one last note about the structure of tonight's event. Each speaker will have a couple of minutes to talk about their role in the film. We will start with Clarissa, followed by Jared, Michelle, and then Alethia. Then we'll have a brief conversation. And right before the Q&A, Alethia will perform some of the musical instruments, the flutes, that you see on the table to the left of you. Yes. So with that, I am going to turn it to Jared, who's going to start. Sorry, Clarissa, my bad. Clarissa's going to start.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcela, for the kind introduction. Thanks all the familiar faces, friends, and dear colleagues who came to this lecture tonight. Thanks, friends who are at home, hopefully, who told me they would be watching this on Zoom. Thanks for all the support. It's really special moment for me to be here with some of my collaborators. This project took 4 years to be made. It was very impacted by COVID, so being able to show at the biennial and celebrate through this lecture and share the process and all the rich moments that we shared in this process is really special. So thanks to all my collaborators and those who are not here too. I was given the very difficult task to give an introduction of this body of work in a maximum of 10 minutes. So I'm going to be like showing very fast images and just hoping to give a little bit of context that goes beyond the film that is Before the Volcanoes Sing, that is in the biennial. These are just images to locate how the film is upstairs. Hopefully most of you had an opportunity to see it. We are focusing on the flutes in this conversation, but the project goes way beyond that. I call this little room my blue cave. It has this intimate aspect that relates to many of the cinematographic choices for the film. We'll come back to it, but I wanted to start just mentioning that in 2016, I got interested in exploring Mayan revival architecture, and the film Before the Volcanoes Sing is part of this body of work. But coincidentally, in 2018, I had some of the works, the beginning of this body of the work, shown here at the Whitney. And I just wanted to show these images because all the research that was done for this work in 2017 unfolded into the film Before the Volcanoes Sing. This is a still from Chumaya, a dance film performance that was shot at the Hollyhock House in Los Angeles. Hollyhock House is one of the cement block houses designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. I was very interested in the fact that Frank Lloyd Wright was looking at ancient Templar Mayan structures to develop those houses from that time period. And it's something that is not very talked about in the way those buildings have been historicized. And I wanted to bring those references back. So I went on a journey that was very much a research of reading, talking to scholars who were specialists on Mayan culture, architecture, performance, and understand the relationships between the building and other things. So what I'm showing here is just like I was doing research, perhaps in a more traditional way. And I shared with Clarissa Sepulveda, who was the performer and choreographer of that film. And for example, here, this is, I guess, a chocolate cup unrolled, and it's a procession. So I was also looking a lot at mural and pottery paintings and seeing what kind of embodiment was represented in that and trying to bring that to the music, we are gonna talk about music in this film, to the dance back then. And this is the Mayan Theater, another Mayan revival structure in LA. Was a movie palace in the 1920s. Today is a nightclub. And I did a beautiful archaeological study with scholar Megan O'Neill, who was at the time at LACMA, and walked me through the theater, showing me, where the specific references for the interior design that were all recreations, really appropriations of like Mayan archaeological sites, which you can see here, for example, right? I'm not explaining this because they are just more as a visual reference for what I was doing and a process of years. In this first body of work, embodiment to dance performance was what I was interested in, and that is present both in the sculptures and the film. Now we are back to Before the Volcanoes Sing. This is, again, the Mayan Theater, so a place that I first encountered studying and then went to do the sculptures and then went back to film. When I finished that body of work that has Chumaya and all the sculptures from the Maya, there were two things that I was not satisfied with. One of them was the fact that I used Mayan revival as, let's say, an excuse to then learn and educate myself about Mayan culture. But my desire was actually to connect those buildings to the present Mayan community in LA, and very much speak from a place where indigenous people were of the present or a part of our community and not a history, not just a history, something from the past. So I wanted to collaborate with Mayan contemporary artists who could be in conversation with me. And I went on to a journey of like finding these people, because it's not that I just wanted any Mayan contemporary artist. I wanted someone who would be asking the same questions as I. So this here is my first Mayan Quiche Cachequel Mayan artist, poet, multidisciplinary artist, Rosa Chavez. In the film, for those who have seen, she's a poet, and we used excerpts from 5 of her poems. On the outside of the room upstairs, you can see the main poem and the poem that gave name to the film. Hopefully you can see highlighted to the right, Before the Volcanoes Sing, and Antes de que los volcanes cantes, and Mohawk Che Bichandri Shkanulab. I traveled with Rosa in Guatemala, and we filmed in 5 different locations that we chose together based on the poems that we were using in the film, but also 5 specific locations that could present references of Mayan culture today. So it was a traditional Mayan healing center, the Quiche capital, Gumarca ruins, which you can see here. The Atlislan Lake, which is a sacred volcanic rate in the south of Guatemala. This is also from and I'm forgetting now, but so being in conversation with Rosa, it was like a whole year of like Zoom conversations before I could actually go to Guatemala, film with her. And I feel that very much the decisions of what to film came out of our interactions. And in the same way, in a similar way, I was introduced to Hilfil del Brito Bernal, who's an Ixil Mayan artist based in California. And he's a painter, but also he studies classical Mayan hieroglyphs, calligraphy, and I asked him to write the title of the film, Before the Volcanoes Sing. So also in the film, you see him explaining how he got to that. And we filmed with him at the Southern House in Los Angeles, here. And the aspect of their practice that interested me is that they are excavating Mayan ancestral knowledge and traditions, but they are filling up gaps that exist in these bodies of knowledge. And they are doing this from a place of obviously being Mayan contemporary artists. So, for example, in the case of Tohil, let's see, here, this is this is the glyph for singing, el cantante, and he explains that in the film. And this is a mountain with fire, with its volcano. But all the rest, and this is also a calendrical, the first one, it's the before. But there is a lot of graphic elements and how you organize the sentences, which is not clear and fully decodified at this point, and he has to make these decisions, and that's an act of recreation. And I thought it would be very interesting to put that in friction with Mayan revival architecture, which is an architectonic style devised by Western architects looking at Mayan indigenous construction and not really collaborating, giving credit to it. So there is an interesting, for me, very generative conversation that, in the same way that Rosa Chavez writes her poems in Spanish and gets help to translate them into Quiche, because Quiche is her maternal language that she spoke a little bit as a child and lost it when they moved to Guatemala City, where she was educated, right? So it's like all these moments of translation are, for me, very important for this project. I will just mention briefly here and show that all the considered cement block houses by Frank Lloyd Wright are also featured in the film. We didn't get permission to film inside, so this was a little bit of a guerrilla style shoot where we went in front of the houses and just Alethia performed with the flutes and we filmed. But there are 4 of them, and they are listed here, and there is a moment for them in the film. So we are here to talk about the flutes, which is a whole other journey, and that took me over a year to make. Initially, I mentioned that one of the things that I came out of my first phase doing like Mayan revival related work was to collaborate with contemporary Mayan artists, which happened in the film. And the other one was that when I was finishing Chu Maya, the dance performance film, I wanted the sound to be made with pre-Columbian Mayan flutes. I wanted to use flutes that were in museum collections and bring them to life through contemporary music. And I went down the journey of going to LACMA and the Fowler Museum, museums in LA that I knew that had pre-Columbian collections. I'm based in LA. And even though there was interest in the project, I very soon realized that they would allow me perhaps to borrow the flutes, but that they would have to be protected inside vitrines and not used as instruments because of saliva and preservation and etc. So I thought that I would never be able to do the project until curator Victoria Leal from the Denver Art Museum, I was telling her, was like, I have this project that I want to make, but I will never be able to because I can't get anybody to let me play these pre-Columbian instruments. And I will give credit to Matthew Robb from the Fowler Museum, who said, like, I think I can get one ocarina and I will go through the administrative, loopholes to maybe you can play that one. I was like, I can make a whole film with like one ocarina. I wanted to have a selection of flutes that it could become also almost like a flute orchestra. So Victoria put him in touch with Jared, and Jared had this amazing research on pre-Columbian flutes where he 3D scans and print them to make them available. We'll talk more about that. I just put two of the flutes that were specifically scanned for this film, so the original and the 3D replicas there. I also wanted to have these images here because we printed these flutes twice and they were treated slightly different, which ended up having a different result and a different sound quality. This method of 3D printing, which is here, it was with Collaborators in Ukraine. It's a ceramics 3D studio that doesn't exist any longer because of the war. And those flutes that were supposed to be very accessible now became something really pristine again, because I don't know where to print something like this. I didn't find a place like this in the US. They have their patent-specific porcelain, I think, mix, where they print all the 3D files that they get this way, and then you coat the objects that are 3D printed with different kinds of ceramics. So that's why you are seeing here that says single terracotta slip coast and double, because I tried different ways of making them, and the result was actually very different. And this is us at MPAC, which is the Experimental Media and Performing Arts Center, commissioned the piece and helped us to go through all the issues for 4 years. Here is just an example of how complicated the communication sometimes was with Collaborators. Two of the flutes I printed a little bigger, and to be able to film inside, so there is no CG in the film. Everything is very analog, let's say. And I wanted to show this because so this is a lens that is now the name is the photographers in a probe. It's a lens that really does like really small details. I forgot the name, the technical macro lens. Thank you, Alethia. But it's a very specific macro lens that is this tube. That's like how we can really film like tiny things. And I wanted to insert that inside the flute. So, and that's what happens here, if you can see that. Because my idea for this film is that air that is blown into the flutes would take us into these journeys across time, geography, and different architectonic spaces. So this is one of the images that was filmed inside of this flute. I will stop here. There is a lot more to say, but we'll come back to all of these points, and maybe Jared can take it from here and talk specifically about the making of the flutes.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jared Katz. I'm really delighted to be here, so thank you for having us all, and thank you, Clarissa, for being such an amazing artist to work and collaborate with and bringing us all together. So I quickly wanted to go over a few points. I am a classic academic, so I wanted to give you a brief organization of these next 5 minutes. So Clarissa asked me to first touch upon the music in the classic Maya area. Then I'm going to talk briefly about the process of 3D scanning and printing the instruments, and then wrap up by talking in detail about some of the instruments that we're looking at and that Alethia did such an amazing job performing and Michelle did such an amazing job composing for. So first, I wanted to geographically and temporally situate us, another classic academic move. So this is the Maya area. It spans the southern part of Mexico into the Chiapas and then the Yucatan Peninsula, Guatemala, Belize, and the northern parts of Honduras and El Salvador, for those of you who might not know. And we're primarily talking about instruments from the classic period, and this spans from 250 to 900 CE. So now you know where and when we're talking about. So when I tell people I study ancient Maya musical practices, the first question I usually get is, how do we know anything about ancient music? So there's two primary forms of evidence. There are artistic depictions of musicians performing, and this really helps us to understand the context of these musical performances, right? Where is music being performed? What types of instruments are being performed in different ceremonies? And then, of course, the instruments themselves that survive for us to look at and play today. So I want to give just a couple brief examples. So this is a scene on a Maya ceramic vessel of the Maya ball game. And a lot of you have probably heard of the ball game. It's this extremely important sporting event, but it's also political. It's ceremonial, right? It's religious in nature. And so we have these two ball players who are squaring off. The ball is right here in the center. The ball game's about to begin, right? So there's all this momentum building. And then back here, we have two musicians. One playing a conch shell and then one playing a bark trumpet. Right? So they're in this big stone ball court. You can see the lines of the ball court behind it. There's people standing on top of it. And the sound from these trumpets are hitting against the stone. They're being emanated outward and upward. And think about the embodied experience of an ancient person sitting in this stage, right, in this arena and encountering that music. It would have been so powerful, right? It would have reverberated in your chest. And if you're not at this event or someplace else at the site, you know you're missing out, right? So the power of music to help build this sense of ceremony and pageantry. Here's a political procession happening where we have a leader being borne aloft in a litter, and he's accompanied by a conch shell trumpet player and 4 other trumpet players. So imagine this ruler is being carried from one place to the next, and you know from vast distances that he's coming because there's this cacophony of trumpets that's traveling with him, right? The power of spectacle that these rulers have, these Maya rulers were able to create through music. And finally, something that Clarissa thinks a lot about, right, is looking at music and dance within a courtly setting. So here we're in a palace. We have a ruler sitting on this throne. We have a dancer performing, and then a variety of musicians playing trumpets, a drum, and rattles over here, right? And thinking about how music has the ability to craft a space, right? Our interpretation, how we perceive a space, is so... music has so much ability to shape that. And this is what's so powerful about Clarissa's work, is she's using music to reclaim these spaces. And so when she told me about this project, I was immediately on board. The next element I wanted to talk about are the instruments themselves. So throughout my work, I documented over 400 ancient Maya instruments. And there's 3 primary classifications of instruments. There are aerophones, which include flutes. It includes whistles, ocarinas, trumpets. Idiophones include rattles, rasps, and bells, and membranophones include drums. So I 3D scanned a bunch of these to create an online database, basically, to let people around the world see the instruments, kind of online, rotate them, things like that. Unfortunately, money is a thing, and I was never able to launch this database because I could not afford to do so. But in the process of doing this, I was working at a small museum in Antigua, Guatemala, the Museo Vical, and there was a school right next door, and students would come over and see me playing and recording these instruments. And it really bothered me, as Clarissa was getting at, that due to my academic background, I was granted access to these when they were not, when musicians weren't, when artists were not. And so was there a way that I could make them more accessible for everyone? I was already 3D scanning them, and so then I wondered, could I 3D print playable replicas? So this is what the initial scans look like. And I use a technique called photogrammetry. So essentially I take hundreds of images and then use software to stitch them together to make this photoreal finish. So you can look at the finger holes, you can look at the mouthpiece, you can get a sense of the instrument. So this is what it looks like when first 3D scanned. But essentially it's a solid block, right? And so the next thing I needed to do was go in using a variety of software and sculpt out the interior. So I had to sculpt out the mouth, the mouthpiece up here, the sounding edge, which allows the instrument to sound, all of the resonance chambers, the ducts, the finger holes. So this took hours and hours of time to do. And then you cross your fingers and you print it and you hope that it plays. If it doesn't play, you go back to the previous step, you sculpt again. And then if it was an instrument I had the privilege of getting to play the original, I would compare the 3D print to the original and keep modeling until it was almost identical in pitch. And I was pretty surprised by how close I was able to get them to sound. So finally, I wanted to touch upon some of these instruments in particular that Clarissa used within Before the Volcanoes Sings. So these 2 are from the Museo Vical in Guatemala, and both of these are what I call globular flutes. So in order to play them, you have to blow across the sounding edge here, kind of like a Western transverse flute. Alethia is able to make so many more sounds than I was ever able to out of these flutes. And so this is part of the power of getting it into the hands of people who are far more skilled than myself. And of course, Michelle's composition is just really highlights what these instruments are truly able to accomplish. So this flute over here is in the form of a monkey, and this is in the form of a person. And then these two are from the Denver Art Museum. So this is also a globular flute. There are 3 resonance chambers, one in the head, one in the torso, and one in the lower section of the body. There's 3 finger holes, one right here in his waist belt, which looks like a serpent, and then 2 in the back. And in this case, there's a figure, you see his face here. He's wearing a jaguar headdress, and he has claws on his arms and feet. He's holding a blowgun. And then over here, we have an ocarina in the form of a woman carrying a monkey and a child. So this has 2 finger holes and a mouthpiece in the back. So again, classic academic conclusions. Both of them tie to Clarissa's work. I wanted to really highlight how music is such an essential part of ceremony and daily lives of Maya people. And this is why Clarissa's use of it to reclaim these spaces is so important. And then also by engaging with this 3D printing technology, recreating these instruments, it just makes the ability of the instruments and to activate them so much more, gives them so much more potential. So that's my little spiel. Thank you all for your attention.
So now it's me. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm more than happy to be here today. Also because for us it's an important moment of celebration of this work that took so long. And but I would like to share with you all my feelings and sensations. You can imagine what happened when I arrived to MPAC during the residence, and Clarissa just opened and showed us all these flutes. And I didn't know what to do with, because each flute is unique. And as Jared showed you, sometimes we have like variations of pitch and scale, so we cannot work from, basically it's a moment of discovery, per discovery for me. And if this was wonderfully made, and each flute, as you saw, is a story, because we have a character, we have an animal, we have very strong figures. And I think the most beautiful thing in this project is that Clarissa also sent me the poems from Rosa Chaves. Is one of this poem. One of these poems is called "Dame permiso," and I was asking for this permission to use this instrument because, of course, all this music has a very strong use on the Mayan culture, and I was in this situation in which I would like to, first of all, have a very respectful attitude towards this instrument. It's not just like experiment and make things, It's much more than that. So much of the time was like observing and listening to the flutes. For me, this work was more passive, in the sense of I was receiving or trying to get inside these tunes that are already inside the flutes. And for this, with a very patient and many hours of work with Alethia playing, we were discovering things. And it was amazing because also the pitches changed. I remember that the first time Alethia proved some of the flutes, we have like a scale, but I think the flute begins to react. So for me, as a composer, an instrument is a alive thing. For this also, the respect and the attitude, I think I try to cultivate it. And I remember that we are trying to, one of the flutes, I think is the monkey, we are just on the fundamentals, That means the lower pitches. And second or 3 days, we discover that it was not enough. There is a lot of other notes coming and surprising us in the process. And like that, we just begin to discover this melody, like. And I was trying to also recognize kind of which sense and each organization I could do to these notes to bring this melody that's for me was the more convincing. So for that sense, sometimes I cannot recognize myself in this project as composer, because I have this impression that we are composer together with the flutes. Because in the classical approach of composition, I don't know if there is some musicians here, we work with classical instruments. So in school, in conservatory, basically what we do as a composer is knowing and working with classical instruments that can be, you have like the rent, we have like already some classical traditional use. So before compose for them, we know very well what is a flute, what is a violoncello, but this case, no, it was a process in which I was learning for this instrument and without knowing nothing before. So you can also imagine my my feelings. That is, it's a whole adventure. So it was a process of discovery, sound quality, personality, character, musical, symbolic meaning. As we mentioned, also the way the flutes are working with the space, because some of them are extremely high and they have a very specific function, as the birds, for example. You can imagine what is a small whistle in form of a bird. What is a bird? And so many meanings. It's maybe someone trying to call or to communicate in the forest with someone else, or maybe trying to communicate to the spirits that are in a very, very high space. And this project was just perfect because we are also in residence at the MPAC. This is a place in which you can modulate and can change the concert room. And so all the sounds, they were very, very carefully worked and recorded in very specific acoustic conditions, because in this space we could modulate also the time of reverb in the room, moving all these panels and things around. So we try to give, and to offer to the flutes the conditions, the best conditions we have, and could be better and perfect in this sense. And after this, I think it's also important to mention that there is the flute and also the flutist, because it's a very physical way to play it, and many techniques. The origin is based on the mouth, on the tongue, or articulation. Sometimes I also ask Alethia to sing inside it, or to use specific techniques that now are available for us as contemporary artists and composers. So the approach is totally contemporary. There is not an idea about doing something historical concerning the music. The approach is totally contemporary, but with this attitude and this approach to the instrument. And and also have to mention that, that's good. This is a very big ocarina. You can see that on the photos. But for example, this ocarina doesn't sound so there is a very small sounds like breath sounds, and I also in the score as Clarissa has all the construction, the visual construction in the score, used it also in the theatrical way in which there is a pause, silence, but Alethia is just moving the ocarina in front of the head and taking it away. So all this use were also, we also investigated this not only as a musical instrument, but also as a scenic theatrical object. And you can also, so here we have like lots of contemporary techniques, and I use also traditional way to notate it, because of course this is for today. We know that the history. Yeah, it's nice to have Jared here, because the history of music notation is very complex. You have many kinds of notations, and the idea here was to use the musical score just as a practical way to fix things, to facilitate the work for Alethia, because Alethia was working with me, but during the process, sometimes she also participated in the many sessions with Clarissa to work on the film. So I need to give to Alethia support to keep that and to help her to memorize all the things. And this relation with the memory is also something that is very nice to mention, because it's the origin of the music. Music is here also to help us to remember what is important. And I see also the flutes like that. So this also, for me, was a kind of spiritual journey of this project too. And I just to finish, because we would like to demonstrate, and I also have many things to show you. I would like to mention that we add some sound processing, because the film, Clarissa films, also goes to a direction that is very immersive and full of images, and especially what concerns the Temazcal experience. And also for me, it was a very big challenge to imagine how to sonorize this experience.
The Temazcal is the steam room, and it's when Rosa is in this traditional Mayan healing center being treated. So to have this kind of surreal, immersive sound, sometimes I also processed the flute, so there is an electronic treatment. The idea is to give to listener the idea of the transformation, and deep transformation, deep spiritual journey through sounds. And maybe you can, I don't know, about the... Well, maybe yes, I love everything you said. I'm already interrupting and breaking the protocol. Sorry, I'm the director. Can I do that? No, I wanted to say that there is something that Michelle told me during the residency that we had. We started the project, the first residency was about the music, and I think Alethia was... I started with Jared, obviously making the flutes, but then I would bring all the copies to Alethia, for Alethia to play this in LA, to make sure that they were playable. And it turns out that 3D printing is not so reliable as you would imagine. So you get the same file, you print 3 times, only one of those flutes play. The first flutes that I made was with PLA and with a filament that left a lot of residue inside the flutes, and it wouldn't play easily. So even like this first residency, it was a little bit of a surprise. It's like, are we going to really be able to play the flutes? But the second day that we were just going through these experiments, Michelle said, I know it. The music's in the flutes. We just need to find it. And it's like this approach to working, I think it's very aligned with what I wanted to do with this project, that even though you are looking at scores here, the music was not imposed onto the flutes, but it was really like this process of learning with those objects what they are now, today, after going through all these processes of translation. But maybe before we continue, I think it would be nice to hear from Alethia the experience of playing those flutes in relationship to your experience of obviously playing a modern classical flute, so then we can open for conversations and demonstration.
Sure. For me, it was a fascinating experience because I'm used to playing an instrument that went through many years of development to make it very playable and for evenness of tone and intonation, and then getting these instruments that are so unique and that we had to find each sound, each note, each tuning became really interesting research. So for this project, my first participation was trying all the prints, all the different 3D prints, and trying to understand why some of them played and some others didn't. So we thought maybe there was an excess material blocking the airway, or there was too much texture inside the instrument, and the airstream wasn't flowing properly. And that is when Clarissa decided to try this dipping the 3D prints in ceramics for it to make the interior smoother and make them more playable. But then each time you dip it in the ceramics, it loses the texture outside, and all the details of the faces and the traits. So we had to find really the balance between making them playable and having them still look as close as the original. So for the music, we have these instruments that are modern recreations of ancient artifacts. So the music had to recreate that as well. So working with Michelle, we came up with the idea of combining playing techniques and using classical flute playing techniques with contemporary music playing techniques. So for the classical, we have this trying to find the best possible sound for each note, and the articulation, which is the way that wind players start the notes. We start with a syllable or a consonant, usually a T, and that is the beginning of our emission of the sound. So this is what we call articulation. So we decided we were going to use the best tone approach, which is classical, and the articulation as well. But then we would move into the extended techniques of the wind instrument playing, that are techniques that were developed by contemporary music, that were trying to find novel ways to make new sounds with the classical instruments. So I can show you some of the techniques we used. So let me start. when you want to make an instrument sound differently, and here I'm talking about the orchestra flute, that is a very ancient instrument that went through a development phase, but we are basically playing the same instrument as in 1831 was the last big change of the technique for the flute. So it's an instrument that we have played for a long time. And how can you make that instrument that is so well known sound differently? So we use what Michelle was talking about. We use the sounds that we can create within the body to add to the flute sound. So we can sing and play at the same time. I'm going to demonstrate that with this little whistle type. It's a bird. It's missing the beak. It's a bird. So I'm using the regular whistle-like tone. I'm using the fingerings. It's got 2 holes, and I'm singing into it, and I'm using the articulation. I'm doing tuka 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 while I play. So there's a bunch of different techniques for it to sound differently. And we also have a technique called frullato. That is when you say trrr while playing. So you take any instrument and then. That's another technique. Then we also wanted to explore just the sound of the air going through the instruments. In classical music, we try to hide the air. We only want the sound of the instrument, and we try to hide the noise of the breathing. And for this film, we wanted to really dive into all the little noises that the body makes to produce the sound. So it was very interesting to see what happens when you look for the air sound instead of trying to hide it. So you have the regular sound. So that is a combination of blowing through the instrument and then using a strong articulation to make the air speak louder within the instrument. So this was our way to combine this ancient and modern, using modern techniques to play these recreated ancient artifacts. And I think that is why this soundtrack goes so well with the film, this modern interpretation of ancient art. And that was fascinating.
Yeah, the way the choice of having the body very present was from the beginning, right? It's like my interest in embodiment and performance that is not prescribed, but that there is a lot of room for improvisation. To be in the present was very much like a choice that we all agreed. So I really had like microphones really close to Alethia's mouth, which it's usually, you don't do that in classical recordings. You want to erase the person behind the instrument, right? and which is like for me conceptually the opposite what I was looking for. And also the concert hall at MPAC, as Michelle mentioned, we had a lot of control over the modulation of the sound, but we chose at some point to lift all these curtains that are even in this room just to muffle the sound. We actually lifted everything, and the sound was just traveling and being modulated by that architecture in very beautiful and almost like unexpected ways. So in the film also, I am interested in creating these relationships of space, the historical space, but the physical space of the chamber inside the flutes and the architectonic spaces where we were filming. So it made a lot of sense to work with sound in that way. Also language in the film through the poems and translation. For me, it's almost like wind instruments. They are like a continuation of a human's body, and language for me is music too, right? That was like one of my guiding principle or thinking of how I wanted to connect the poem with the music, because it's all sounds that human bodies produce. I don't know how we are doing on time. And
yeah, I knew it was going to be a very ambitious program. But Alethia, you're going to perform a little later, but I will reduce some of my questions that I had, because I also want to give an opportunity to the audience to ask questions. The first question that I had for you, Clarissa, you're kind of pointing at it, but maybe I'll ask you to also tell us more about specific techniques in the film, but I'll read a little bit of the question I had, because I think what's fascinating about this film is that I think we all have, even though it's so multifaceted, so there's so much research that goes into it, but I think when you see the film for the first time, you're not coming without any previous knowledge. I think we've all have been to natural history museums where we've seen these objects probably encased under plexiglass, static, and I'm deliberately using the words objects and artifacts because they're not presented to us as artworks. But with this film, you are taking us through this sonic journey that combines indigenous systems of knowledge with Western methods of research, but while also attending to and minding the gaps in the archive. You're not hiding that. So my question is about the gaps and what we don't know or what we think we know about the flutes and about music. And so, and to add a little bit more of substance to this question, I want to bring the words of Vic Brooks, who shout out to Vic. Vic was a producer of the film, and I don't think Vic is at MPAC anymore, but
it was the curator at the time.
And so Vic says, quote, "In having the instruments played in a traditional concert hall, in a recording studio, and within Los Angeles Mayan revival-style buildings, Tossin plots an alternate historical, architectural, and geographical lineage that makes audible the influence of Maya culture on U.S. cultural production, which has been erased by the multiple acts of dislocation and appropriation of Maya people, objects, architecture, and motifs caused by centuries of colonization." So the question was about how you bridge these many acts and forms of dislocation through your practice. And I think you use many clever, cool techniques in the film. And so can you mention a couple of those?
Yeah, so one, I think the main I maybe already touched upon, in terms of like the cinematography, I always thought of the camera as taking the place of air that is blown into the flute and then resonates in these different architectonic spaces. air is also what makes language, what is makes us able to communicate, and the gaps are actually, I think, the spaces where history can be rewritten in different ways. It's like, sure, you have the gap of ancestral knowledge that is being excavated by this contemporary Mayan artist. That being, let's say, the main one when we talk in terms of how much do we know about Mayan history and culture, but breaking with the temporal idea that that's a culture from the past. It's like the gaps are almost like what enables us to reinscribe different ways of looking and putting together these different spaces. Music has a different quality than the other arts. I operate very much visually, right? If you the final work is a film, so obviously it's guiding you through this journey visually. But Michelle and I also made a piece, a different editing of the recordings as a sound installation. And it's different because music is perhaps one of those static experiences that has the potential to skip language, because you go to feelings, you connect to things perhaps in a different way than you would do. I feel that visually you go to language immediately and then to narrative. So the music is also what is connecting all these different temporalities and geographies in the film, and the flutes become these characters that takes us into this journey. I don't know, I'm going beyond your
That's
question.
great. And I think how you started with air, which is so true. Air is what makes the words sound, what makes the flute sound, and your explanation makes a lot of sense, because there's a part where you're seeing the camera go through the chambers in the flutes, and then you're in the chamber of impact. These all are both sound chambers, and so it's very clear that almost friction between this replica of a pre-Columbian object and this very Western concert hall, like you feel it, and but sometimes somehow you make it work all together. It gels very well. I have a question for Jared. It's a burning question that I've been thinking a lot about when it comes to contemporary artists. Using 3D printing, and there's a couple of artists doing this in really cool ways. So my question for you is, as the acquisition of pre-Columbian artworks is scrutinized and calls for repatriation become stronger, what do you think is the future of 3D printing replicas of Mesoamerican antiques and I guess other cultures as well?
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a really great question. I think it opens up the possibilities, as you're saying, right, to certainly engage with repatriation, while if the country that the artwork is being repatriated to is okay with it, to have a reproduction remain. I think it allows for access to these artworks that, like as Clarissa experienced, right, that these are instruments, and as you said, they're meant to be activated, they're meant to be heard, and when you remove their voices, it removes one of the key elements that you're supposed to engage with them with. So how do we use these new technologies to help imbue these artworks with their voice again, right? So giving people a different way to perceive them and engage with them, that, as you so aptly said, and seeing them statically displayed in a case in a museum removes the essence of what that encounter is supposed to be. So how do we reanimate these? And I think solution was to try to use 3D printing. And certainly I think in terms of acquisitions, right, there's so many artists engaging with different Mesoamerican historical cultures like Maya, Aztec, in really new and exciting ways to explore identity. And Clarissa highlighted a number of artists that she works with who do this in really powerful ways. So I don't just think 3D printing, but also engaging with these artists who are celebrating identity and connection, right, is a really great way to continue acquiring while still repatriating the artworks that should go home. Yeah, absolutely.
There was something that I wanted to say about the 3D prints. So for Jared, as an academic and doing science, your approach is to create a replica that reproduces a sound that is as similar as possible to the original. And my take is that there is no way of making it identical. That the sound will have some alteration, and for instance, for printing them with the ceramics technique, we had to thicken the walls of the flute because of the limitations of the 3D procedure, and actually all these layers of change and recreation is what I was interested in, where, so the gaps again, where it's not precise, where you enter with subjectivity, where which I think that the film has all these layers of not actually, it's not reproducing, it's creating something with what we have, which are these histories with gaps, which are these histories of erasure, and so on and so forth, right? So it's I'm interested in that, in how complicated it gets to dismiss, for example, something like Mayan revival buildings in Los Angeles. They are all landmarks. They're not going to go anywhere. So can we talk about them in a different way? Can we connect them to different histories? Can we make use of them in a different way? And there is no way of saying, no, I don't know. It's like, it's, right? And with the replicas, yes, they are replicas. They are going to have a different sound. We don't have ancient recordings. I'm sure that scholars can assume many things based on, the I don't know, paintings in pottery and other things. But in the end, it's like we are creating these narratives that have gaps and have limitations. So I hope that the project articulates that in a poetic, immersive way that created this bridge between different cultures, geographies, temporalities. It's very broad, but I think that's like the guiding ideas, I guess, principle.
Well, maybe we can see that in musical form.
Embody it.
Yeah. Alethia, do you want to perform one of the scores? Thank you.
has a monkey face, and we have a larger one, which is called Big Monkey. So to tell you a bit more about how we play these instruments, there's two ways of making them sound. Some of them you just blow through them, and they have like a second opening, and there is a chisel-shaped edge that cuts the airstream in two. Part of it goes inside the instrument, and the other part goes outside, and that is what makes the sound. It vibrates, and the sound waves, and all those technical things. And these other ones, they don't have this other opening with the chisel-shaped edge. So where the air parts in here is right here on this outer edge of the mouth hole. So that is why they are not that easy to play. If you take this instrument and just blow, they won't automatically sound. So you really have to find the tone. It's like when you blow into a bottle and you want to make it sound, you have to find the right air speed, direction, and everything. And I think that is very interesting about the playing of these instruments. And this one works like that. The air, half of the airstream goes in, and the other half goes outside. And then the length of the air column, we call it, stops at the first open hole. And as we close the holes, the path of the air gets longer, and the sound gets lower in pitch. So that is how these instruments work. Now I'm going to demonstrate this one that we call female ocarina.
Thank you, Alethia. I think I know I want to be cognizant of everyone's time, and I know that people want to get grab dinner. We have a couple of minutes, maybe 1 or 2 questions, if there are any in the audience. Andy over there has a microphone.
Hi there, thank you so much. I'm just wondering about the original makers of these instruments, and perhaps with that, also, are there any makers of these flutes now? Not, I mean, the 3D printing, but like by hand, I guess.
Great question, yeah. So in terms of the original makers, we know some. And of course, there's lots of gaps in that knowledge. But they're ceramicists, really highly accomplished ceramicists. We don't know if they are the same ceramicists, for example, that are making these beautiful polychromed vessels, or are they a more specific subgroup who are specializing in musical instruments. We know that we have evidence, for example, on some flutes, that a finger hole has been mended and moved before firing. So there are particular scales that are being recreated, and so these ceramicists are looking for these scales, right, to elicit these, as Michelle says, like to elicit the voice of these instruments in prescribed ways. And so there are scales that are intentionally being recreated across the Maya area by these different skilled artisans who are making these. So that's the little bit I can tell you about the ancient instrument makers. There are certainly contemporary Maya musicians who are recreating musical instruments, recreating ocarinas and using them to perform today. Grupo A is a group of 3 brothers in Guatemala who are doing this. The music they're making is really, they have this piece that's called Sunrise that's just 10 minutes of animal sounds, basically only using instruments to mimic what it's like to experience the sunrise in the jungle. So there's definitely musicians today recreating instruments and using them to do really exciting things, yeah.
Hello. My question is about the original instruments and what sort of precautions you need to take when handling and playing them to preserve them.
Sorry, I guess it's me again. Yeah, it's a great question. There's a lot of precaution that needs to go into it. And a lot of the museums in Guatemala let me play the instruments, and a lot of the museums, all the museums in the US did not let me play the instruments. I was talking to someone about this, and they said, oh, well, you know, like the Maya typically use cinnabar, which is this red, really mercurial pigment, to decorate things, which I did know, not thinking that I'm putting that in my body every time I'm playing these instruments. So there's also some some negative side effects to the player. We'll see what happens in terms of my health. No, I'm just kidding. No, certainly it's, you know, you need to care for the instrument as well as the player. So it's a very careful thing. I don't know if that answered your question, though.
Hi, Clarissa.
Hi. I think it's
Thing on? Yeah. I had a question. You referenced so many things, but I noticed in the score that there wasn't a time signature, and it got me thinking about time. So I had questions about, like, how long did you work on this project? And I had questions about how long was the music in 4/4 time? How do you measure time? And the gaps in time. It seemed like time was always being referenced, but never being spoken about.
Yes, and it's a time-based work, right? The film. The more specific musical aspect of it, I'll let you talk about, Michelle. But I will say something that, like, we saw Alethia perform the 2 of the flutes here. What you see in the film, it's a much more complex composition, because even while we were working, we said, well, the final music, it's when the film is done. because it's not that you do the, you film and then you have the music and you put them together. No, the way we worked was very organic. So we had this first residency at MPAC where we did some recordings and we played with most of the flutes. There was one is still missing that we didn't have there, that we continued working over Zoom and recording things and sending to each other, and that's how the last flute got a score. So even though you have one score for each one of the flutes, there are 6, and 2 of them were printed twice, which changed the scale because the size is a little different. Okay, so you have 8. We have 8 scores, but yet it's not that you have the full 8 scores in the film. Sometimes they are mixed. They are combined, just sections of it, right? There is a weaving everything together that is a combination of the narrative, sounds, and the recording of the flutes, and all the music that you hear in the film comes from the flutes. But when we were finishing the film, some of them we altered a little bit, and maybe Michelle can talk more about that. So, and I like that way of working because that's also the way that I worked with the Clarissa Sepúlveda, the performer and choreographer of my previous film, Chimaya, where we created a vocabulary of movements, and we knew which vocabulary was used for specific locations in the house, but the choreography, if you want to call that, only happened when the film was edited, because then you could say, oh, this is the beginning, the end, and right. So it's that also happened with the music. But
Oh, that's a super good question, because you have the pieces that are actually miniatures, and they have this sense of time, as you notice, written in a traditional way. I use that because I don't want to add more work to Alethia, because the scores are just a support for a visual musical work, because I also need to do something that she was able to play while she was walking and working on the film in different spaces. So my decision was not to make the score visually very complex, but it's complex in terms of sounds, but not in terms of musical writing. And the second thing, so you have the time for concerning the miniatures, and after the time concerning the film, that's a totally different thing, because it's a polyphony. It's something that is a whole composition between music, sound, and images and film editing. And I like to mention also the very important moment. That was a moment we were working together in 2 different rooms. Clarissa were editing images and I was making music, and we are able to interact each day, like, okay, I give this for you, okay, I give this image to you, and oh, I give this music for you, because there is a lot of music, sound editing and sound processing, and the same for the image. So there is a whole thing that was built together. It was not just the music composed and recorded. It's much more than that.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Alethia. Oh, I think we're kind of at time. Michelle, Clarissa, Jared, and thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. Make sure you see the biennial. It's going to be up until August 11th or something like that. Check the website. Yeah. Thank you.